Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. This is part 2 of the video refuting the allegation against the Quran that it has a scientific contradiction in Surah 86 verses 4 through to 6 on the origins of man and where man was created. So we've refuted many arguments in part 1 and we will continue with this as a part 2, and as they keep bringing up these allegations, we'll continue to refute their points. Okay, so a person I'm dealing with, his name is Sheikh Monkfish, and he basically says there's another problem within the verse. He says the problem is that man is created from a fertilized egg and not from a fluid emerging from between the backbone and the ribs. If you don't care about that, so basically, remember what their argument was earlier. Their argument was about, where the sperm comes from. It's not the backbone, it's not the ribs, it's not even in between them. And we've shut them down on that, and we've showed the male reproductive system, how it's not just the testicles, that the sperm travels through the whole reproductive system, and the whole reproductive system of the male goes through the upper region of the prostate glands and so forth. So we've dealt with that point. We've dealt with the point that it's not created in the backbone or the actual rib. It actually precedes, the sperm precedes those areas. It travels those areas. And we've actually shown the proper interpretation of that verse. And then they turn around and say, man is created in semen. It's not about semen, it's about sperm. Well, we've shown that Allah speaks about fluid in the Quran. Therefore, it is a combination of the semen and the sperm. And they obviously work in harmonious together. So obviously he's speaking about both. He's not neglecting one or the other. He's talking just about the semen and not about the sperm. We've already dealt with that point. And so now the argument is, apparently, as Sheikh Monkfish says, the problem is that man is created from a fertilized egg and not from a fluid emerging. My response is, the origins of man does not start from a fertilized egg. The process first starts from sperm, which comes from a man, and I've explained this in my first video. Sheikh Monkfish then in response says, why not say it starts with an unfertilized egg? The author of the Quran shows no awareness that the egg even exists. The egg, in fact, contributes more than the semen, even in genetic terms. And my response to him is, why does the Quran have to mention the ovum? It mentions the fluid of the man because it speaks about the origins of man. Regardless if the egg contributes more, that's irrelevant. The point is, it's the sperm that starts the first contribution. And we already know this because the ovum obviously can't do nothing unless the sperm comes to it. And obviously when it comes, it fuses with the chromosomes of the female, the egg of the ovum, right? So basically the chromosomes come and they connect and fuse with those, with the other chromosomes. It also transfers the genetic information. So that's what Allah speaks about. The origins come from the actual sperm, and then that fuses and connects with the ovum. And it doesn't have to mention the egg and all those other processes. Like I said in my initial video, that the Quran is not a medical journal. It just speaks on general terms on the creation of man. And then he comes back. Sheikh Monkfish says, how can this not be obvious to you? He says, the entire problem is that it only talks about the male fluid and doesn't even show an awareness of the egg. And my response to him is, it doesn't have to show awareness of the egg, because where did the Quran say that is all man is created from is fluid. I mean, if the Quran said the only thing man is created is from the fluid, then of course you could turn around and say, oh, how come it doesn't mention the ovum? How come it doesn't mention this or that? Of course, you could make that claim. But the Quran never says the only thing man is created from is sperm. You see how easily you get refuted? So, did you hear Allah say that the only thing man is created from is fluid? No. If not, why do you assume he ought to mention the ovum? Now that Monkfish got owned on this, he went completely silent on this. Hassan actually comes back to the topic and he brings the same argument again, trying to manipulate the Quran. So we'll go back to that and we'll deal with that in a counter-rebuttal session, which I'll do right now. Hassan writes, he says, as I said, sperm comes from around the testicles. To say it comes from between the backbone and the ribs because it passes round the lower part of the area on its way to the penis sounds like a very tenuous argument. He says, as I said, it's like saying my father, who's from Egypt, came from France because he passed through France. And that wasn't the argument. And my response to him is, I said to him, stop lying. I said, I already refuted the point. Nowhere does the Quran say, or did I say, the sperm is created between the rib. It says it's ejected, i.e. the pathway, i.e. it emerges from the area between the backbone and the rib. And we already made this clear in our first video. It doesn't say it was created from the rib, right? It says it's obviously created in the testicles, the actual sperm, and as it comes up and travels through the prostate area, it emerges from those areas. That's what the Quran says. And stop manipulating and lying against the text of the Quran. I did call him a liar, but he didn't like that. So instead I said to him, you're manipulating the text and being dishonest. And I am giving him my respect because he is a respectful person, Mr. Hassan, in our engagement. Now, one very last point, these stooges come and they try and prove a contradiction in the Quran, but then they actually admit that everyone's opinion is valid. And I actually asked them, do you believe that your version does it actually prove a contradiction? Because they're basically trying to say no one's interpretation is correct. In the end, they actually admit that when they get refuted. They say no one's interpretation is correct, and the Quran is full of, it's just ambiguous because they can't read and understand it, and they get refuted. And they say, oh, it's just ambiguous. But then I ask them, well, if it's all ambiguous, if everyone's interpretation is just as valid, does that mean there's still a contradiction in the Quran? And I asked them, do you agree that your interpretation does not have any factual basis? Mr. Hassan Radwan actually agrees in a text. He says, I agree, it's not a fact. So even after being refuted, they agree that their understanding and their interpretation trying to prove a contradiction in the Quran is not even on factual basis. They admit it's not part of facts. Amazing, isn't it? And then they try and play this manipulation game. It's really cunning, really. Their last point is, because there are different interpretations even among scholars of Islam about this verse, it means it's ambiguous. But I basically said to them, just because people have different interpretations of the verse, it doesn't mean we can't, one isn't speaking the truth. It's basically like saying, oh, I disagree with Darwinian evolution. Does that make it ambiguous? I'm pretty sure you'll say, well, I don't care if you disagree with it and you come up with a different interpretation. You'll say there is still a truthful interpretation, and that is the one that you believe in. So just because there are differences of opinion, it doesn't mean an individual who has a difference of opinion doesn't hold the factual truth. So I don't know what they're doing by saying, oh, just because there's differences of opinion, therefore it's ambiguous, therefore we can never come to factual truth. I'll finish off this video by quoting the inconsistency of atheists or agnostics or critics of Islam, because that's who I'm actually dealing with now. They say, if the Quran is perfect message meant to be understood by everyone, then there wouldn't be any misinterpretations. Therefore, the Quran isn't from God. My response, false. The Quran isn't meant to be understood by everyone, but only by people who think. Surah 10:24. It's not Allah's fault that you missed the boat.